In Alaska, the road doesn't end where the map says. It ends where it wants to. And somewhere out there, on a highway that doesn't exist on any GPS, someone is still waiting at a gas station with your name already on their lips. These stories are real. The darkness is real. And before we go any further, I'd love to know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. Drop it in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and help me reach 1,000 subscribers. Leave a like, share this with someone who won't sleep tonight. Now, let's begin. I want to start by telling you that I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts. I'm a 34-year-old project manager from Tacoma, Washington. I drive a 2019 Ford F-150 with 67,000 miles on it. I have a Costco membership. I drink black coffee, and I think people who claim to see supernatural things either have a chemical imbalance or a desperate need for attention. I say this not to sound arrogant, but because I need you to understand the kind of person I am before I tell you what happened on the Glen Highway in October. Because if a person like me, practical, skeptical, grounded in the measurable and the real, is telling you this story, then you need to take it seriously. I need you to take it seriously. I drove up to Alaska for work. My company was contracted to do a site assessment near Palmer, a small agricultural town about 40 miles northeast of Anchorage. It's not a glamorous assignment. Palmer is famous for its giant vegetables. They have a state fair every year where people grow cabbages the size of a toddler, and for being the kind of place where the winters are long and the people are quiet in a way that isn't entirely friendly. I've been there twice before, both times in summer, when the daylight stretches so obscenely long that your body clock forgets what sleeping means. This time it was October. This time the darkness was already winning. I flew into Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside the terminal windows was the color of a bruise, not a fresh bruise, not that bright violent purple, but an old one, the kind that's already going yellow and green at the edges, wrong and sickly. The temperature on my phone said 28 degrees. Snow was forecast for Wednesday. I rented a Jeep Cherokee at the Hertz counter and spent 20 minutes in the parking garage reminding myself how to drive in cold weather, something my body knew but my confidence hadn't fully remembered. The drive to Palmer from Anchorage takes you through the Matsu Valley on the Glen Highway. It's a beautiful road, genuinely beautiful, the kind of thing you put on a postcard, the Chugach Mountains sitting fat and white on your right, the Nick River Flats spreading out gray and frozen on your left, moose tracks pressed into the muddy shoulders, the occasional eagle circling lazy and enormous overhead. I saw 3 moose in the first 20 minutes. 2 were standing in a ditch eating willow branches, and they watched me pass with the blank, prehistoric indifference that large animals have, like they existed before stress was invented. The third was different. The third was standing dead center in the southbound lane about 2 miles past the Eagle River exit, and it wasn't eating anything. It was just standing there. Still. Its head was turned slightly to the right, toward the tree line, and every muscle in its enormous body looked rigid in a way that animals only get when they detected something. Prey behavior. Fear behavior. In an animal that size, that has almost no natural predators, that's disturbing in a way I can't fully articulate. I slowed, gave it a wide berth in the other lane, and watched it in my rearview mirror until the curve of the road took it out of sight. It never moved. It was still staring at the tree line. I told myself it was nothing. Moose are weird. I put a podcast on, a true crime podcast, which in retrospect feels obscene, and kept driving. I checked into the extended stay America in Palmer around 6 in the evening. Room 114. Ground floor. The woman at the front desk had the deep, permanent fatigue of someone who has worked night shifts for too many consecutive years, and she handed me my keycard without making eye contact. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaning fluid and something beneath it, something organic and faintly wrong that I decided to attribute to the carpet. I ate a Subway sandwich I grabbed on the way in and fell asleep with the TV on, which is something I've done alone in hotel rooms since I was a kid because the silence of unfamiliar places has always felt, not scary exactly, but loaded. Like the quiet is saving something up. Wednesday was fine. The site assessment went well. My contact in Palmer was a friendly guy named Tom who wore Carhartt everything and knew the land better than he knew most people, and we got through the evaluation faster than projected. I called my wife, Sarah, from the parking lot of a diner in Wasilla on the drive back. We talked for 22 minutes. She told me our dog, Biscuit, had gotten into the trash again. Normal, ordinary, beautiful life. I remember feeling grateful. I remember noticing I felt grateful, which means some part of me already knew something was tilting. Thursday is when it started. I needed to make a second visit to the site. Nothing serious, just some additional measurements Tom had flagged after reviewing my initial report. I left Palmer around 7 in the morning, and by the time I was coming back south on the Glen Highway, it was pushing 9:30 at night. In October in Alaska, 9:30 at night is a specific kind of dark. Not the darkness of cities, where the light pollution gives the sky a dirty orange glow and you always feel vaguely observed. This is the darkness of complete geographic indifference. The highway cuts through terrain that simply does not care about you. Boreal forest on both sides, dense black spruce packed tight as fur, the occasional reflective marker on the shoulder catching your headlights and throwing them back, and beyond all of that, nothing. Miles and miles of nothing in every direction. I was tired. That's important to establish, and it's also the excuse I used on myself for the next several hours. I had been on site for 11 hours. I'd skipped lunch. My eyes were doing that thing where they go dry and the road starts to develop a slight shimmer that you know isn't real. I had a half-full thermos of gas station coffee that had gone cold around noon, and I drank it anyway, grimacing at the bitterness, at the metallic aftertaste of old coffee in a metal container. My gas gauge hit the quarter tank mark somewhere past the Eklutna exit. I knew I had enough to make it back to Anchorage easily, but the cold was spiking. My phone said it had dropped to 19 degrees in the last hour, and something about the emptiness of the highway, the absolute absence of other vehicles, made me want the psychological comfort of a full tank. If I broke down out here, even with a cell signal, a tow truck from Anchorage would take an hour minimum. An hour in 19 degrees with a heater that only works when the engine runs is not immediately dangerous, but it's unpleasant in a way that grows. The exit ramp materialized out of the dark with the kind of suddenness that only happens when you're driving tired, not because it appeared suddenly, but because your perception narrows to a tunnel and things outside that tunnel seem to teleport into existence. Exit 9. I didn't remember an exit 9 on this stretch of the Glen, but I'd only driven it twice before, both times in summer, both times in daylight, and highway geography reorganizes itself completely in darkness. There was a sign for a gas station. One of those old green highway signs, the retroreflective kind, standard font, standard everything. It looked normal. I took the exit. The road off the ramp was paved but unlined. No painted center stripe, no shoulder markers. Trees close on both sides. The gas station appeared after maybe a quarter mile, a small operation, 2 pumps under a corrugated metal canopy, fluorescent lights buzzing with that particular frequency that feels like a headache beginning. There was a small convenience store attached. One car in the lot, a very old Subaru Outback with a cracked rear windshield, backed into the corner of the lot in the way that people park when they plan to stay a while or when they don't want their license plate seen from the road. I pulled up to the pump. The fluorescents were doing something wrong with the light, washing everything out, making the shadows between the pumps look deeper than they should have been. I remember noticing that the snow around the base of the pumps hadn't been disturbed, no tire tracks, no boot prints, the surface still unbroken and smooth the way it only is when nothing has moved through it for hours. And yet the lights were on. And yet there was a car in the lot. I told myself the wind had smoothed the snow. It was a reasonable explanation. I got out of the Jeep and started the pump and stood there in the dark and the cold and the hideous buzzing light and breathed steam into the air and listened to the sound of gas flowing into the tank and told myself I was just tired. Just tired. The brain does things when it's tired. It finds patterns. It generates threat assessment from nothing. Evolutionary hangover from the time when being wrong about the presence of a predator was fatal and being right saved your life. My brain was generating false positives. That's all. The door to the convenience store opened and the man behind the counter looked out at me. He was somewhere between 50 and 70, that ambiguous age that hard living creates, with a face that had been weathered by decades of Alaska winters into something that looked less like skin and more like the bark of a birch tree, pale, dry, with deep vertical lines. He was wearing a green canvas work jacket and a wool beanie pulled low, and he was holding a coffee mug in both hands and just looking at me through the glass door with an expression that I can only describe as recognition. Not the polite customer service recognition of, oh, another customer. Recognition like, oh, there you are. I nodded at him through the glass the way you nod at strangers, that quick social Morse code that means I see you, I mean no harm, please reciprocate, and he nodded back slowly, and something about the slowness of it made my stomach do one quiet, small contraction. I finished pumping, I went inside, I grabbed a water and a bag of beef jerky from a rack near the door, and I walked to the counter. He was already behind the register. He'd moved without me noticing him move, which I attributed to being tired, to the fluorescent light which was doing something to my depth perception, making distances feel inconsistent. Heading back to Anchorage, he said. Palmer, actually, I said, which was a reflex lie, the kind of casual misdirection you use without thinking when a stranger knows your direction of travel. Well, toward it. Yeah. He nodded. He ran my card. Looked at the card for a moment before handing it back. Michael, he said. My name is on my credit card. This is not strange. This is completely ordinary. And yet, that's me, I said. Long drive from Tacoma, he said. I stopped. Everything in me stopped. The fluorescent light buzzed. Outside, through the dirty glass, I could see my Jeep at the pump, the dark forest behind it, the unbroken snow. How do you know where I'm from? I asked. He smiled. It was a smile that didn't move his eyes. Your plates, he said. My rental Jeep had Alaska plates. Every rental car at Hertz in Anchorage has Alaska plates. I knew this. I had known this since I picked it up. And I watched my brain perform the rapid, desperate arithmetic of exhaustion. Maybe he recognized me. Maybe I've been here before. Maybe he's mistaken me for someone else. And every calculation came up wrong, and the wrongness sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. I took my card and my water and my jerky and I said thank you and I walked out. I sat in the Jeep for 30 seconds with the engine running and the heat blasting, and I looked at my reflection in the dark window and I said out loud, to no one, you are tired. You are overthinking this. Drive. And I did. I was halfway up the ramp back to the Glen Highway when something caught in my memory like a fishhook. The photos. While I was standing at the register, waiting for my card to process, I had glanced over his shoulder at the wall behind the counter, the kind of look you give the cluttered wall of any rural gas station, the fishing licenses and lottery ticket displays and taped up notices and family photos that accumulate on those walls like rings on a tree. I had registered it all as background noise. But now, on the ramp, accelerating back into the dark, something in that background noise resolved into signal. There had been photos. Photographs, printed on regular paper, like surveillance screenshots. 3 or 4 of them, taped in a rough cluster near the edge of the shelf. And in all of them, I was certain now, not imagined certain but bone certain in the way that real memories feel different from constructed ones, in all of them there was a Jeep Cherokee. My Jeep. The rental. The specific dent on the front passenger fender I'd noticed when I picked it up. The cracked mud flap. The small pine air freshener hanging from the mirror that I had put there myself on Tuesday afternoon. My Jeep. Photographed. From different angles. From outside. I pulled over on the Glen Highway shoulder and I sat there with the hazards on and I opened Google Maps and I searched for the exit I had just taken. Exit 9, Glen Highway, Wasilla. The map showed nothing. No exit. No road. No gas station. The highway in that stretch was a clean line with no branches. I zoomed in until the interface was giving me satellite view and I could see the tree line on either side of the road, and there was nothing there, no clearing, no structure, no break in the trees. I took a screenshot. I have it still. I drove directly to the Anchorage Police Department. Not the state troopers, not a phone call, the physical building on East 4th Avenue, because I needed to be indoors and around other human beings and under fluorescent lights that were supposed to make me uncomfortable. A young officer named Torres, maybe 25, took my statement with the careful blank face of someone trained not to react to what they're hearing. He asked me to show him the exit on the map. I showed him. He looked at it for a long time. "You're sure it was exit 9? He said. "Positive," I said. The sign was clear. He excused himself. He was gone for 11 minutes, I counted, because counting is something I do when I'm afraid and trying not to show it. When he came back, he had a woman with him, older, plain clothes, Detective Reyes, who shook my hand and sat down across from me and asked me to start from the beginning. I told her everything. The snow with no footprints. The man who knew my name before I gave it. The photos on the wall. The rental plates that weren't from Tacoma. She listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You said he looked at you like he recognized you." "Yes." "And you've been on this stretch of highway 3 times this week." "Right." "And you've stopped at other gas stations along the route." I thought about it. 2 others. One on the first day, one on Tuesday night coming back from, yeah. 2. She turned the legal pad around and slid it across the table to me. On it she had drawn a rough sketch of a face. Not detailed, just the basic geography of a person, the shape of the hairline, the set of the eyes, the lines around the mouth. "Does this look like the man you spoke to tonight?" she said. The stone in my chest from earlier came back, heavier now. "Yes," I said. "That's him." She nodded once, slowly, in the way that people nod when they've had a suspicion confirmed and they wish they hadn't. She told me, in the careful, selective way that detectives share information with civilians when they want to avoid panic, that the sketch was of a man who had been connected to a string of incidents on the Glen Highway and the Parks Highway corridor going back 4 years. Incidents involving travelers. Incidents that had begun as reported stalking, as reports of someone who seemed to know too much about people passing through, and that had escalated, twice, into disappearances. 2 people. A woman driving alone from Fairbanks to Anchorage in 2020. A man, a contractor from Oregon, in 2022. Neither found. She told me the man had no confirmed identity, only the sketch built from 7 separate witness descriptions over 4 years, all of which matched each other with an accuracy that meant only one of 2 things: either they had all seen the same man, or some kind of mass hysteria was generating a shared hallucination. She said she did not believe in mass hysteria. She asked me to stay in Anchorage. Not a legal instruction, just a strong recommendation. She gave me her card. I called Sarah that night from my hotel room and I didn't tell her any of it. I said the work was going well. I said the mountains were beautiful. I said I was tired. All of which was true. I flew home Saturday morning. At the airport, waiting at the gate, I opened Google Maps again and went back to that stretch of the Glen Highway. Exit 9. I pinched and expanded the satellite image until it was grainy and pixelated and almost abstract. And in the tree line, just barely visible, just barely distinguishable from the dense black spruce and the shadows between them, there was a structure. Small. Pale. A clearing just large enough for 2 pumps and a corrugated metal canopy. Invisible from the highway. Invisible from any road that exists on any map. Only visible if you know where to look. Or if you're led. The GPS record on my phone, the one that tracks my movements automatically, the setting I never bothered to turn off, showed that on Tuesday night, the first night, my drive back from Palmer had included a 20-minute gap near exit 9. The location data during those 20 minutes showed my phone stationary. Not at a gas station. Not at a road. In the middle of the tree line, 140 feet from the highway. I don't remember stopping Tuesday night. I remember the podcast. I remember the cold coffee. I remember the moose in the southbound lane with its head turned toward the trees. I remember the fear behavior. I have sent Detective Reyes the GPS record. I have not heard back. It's been 6 weeks. I check my email twice an hour, which my wife has noticed and asked about, and I tell her it's a work thing, a project I'm waiting on, which is the most honest lie I've ever told. I still don't believe in ghosts. What happened to me was not supernatural. There was no paranormal component, no thin veil between worlds, no entity from outside the bounds of human comprehension. What happened to me was a man. A man with patience and planning and a specific, horrible interest in people who travel alone on dark highways in the wrong season, in the wrong state, in the place where the forest begins and the distance between one human being and the next becomes, for a few miles, absolute. What happened to me was real. That's the part that I cannot stop turning over in my hands at 3 in the morning when the house is quiet and Biscuit is asleep at the foot of the bed and Sarah's breathing is slow and even and I am the only one awake in a good warm house in a safe neighborhood in a city with streetlights on every block. Real is so much worse than ghosts. Real means he's still out there. Real means there's an exit on a highway that isn't on any map, and the lights are on, and the man behind the counter is holding his coffee with both hands, and he's looking at the road, and he is waiting for the next set of headlights to slow down and take the ramp and come in from the cold. Real means it could be you. I want to tell you that moving to Alaska was my idea. I want to tell you that because the alternative, admitting that I followed a woman 2,400 miles north to a state that receives maybe 4 hours of usable daylight in February and with a primary local news story for 3 consecutive weeks last winter was about a black bear that learned to open car doors in residential Juneau, feels like a special category of masculine stupidity that I'm not entirely ready to own. But that's what happened. Her name was Diane. She was a nurse practitioner recruited by a clinic in Fairbanks, and I was a 31-year-old IT infrastructure technician who could work remotely and who told himself that Alaska sounded like an adventure, when really Alaska sounded like Diane, and Diane sounded like not being alone anymore in my apartment in Reno, Nevada, eating cereal at 11:30 at night and watching strangers on YouTube live better lives than mine. We lasted 14 months. She ended it in December, which in Fairbanks means she ended it when the temperature was 17 below and the sun rose for approximately 4 hours before surrendering to a darkness so complete and so total that it stops feeling like night and starts feeling like the planet has simply decided to stop trying. She was kind about it. She said she needed to focus on the work, on building her practice, on the life she'd come to Alaska to build. She didn't say, and that life doesn't include you, but it was present in everything she didn't say, which is often where the truth parks itself. I should have left. Anyone with ordinary self-preservation instincts would have left. But I had a lease on an apartment on Cushman Street in Fairbanks until April, and I had somehow, in 14 months, built enough of a freelance client base in Alaska to make leaving feel financially irresponsible, and I had a 2017 Dodge Ram that I had spent 4 months learning to winterize and baby through temperatures that I still couldn't fully believe were survivable. And the idea of packing all of that up and driving back to Nevada with my tail between my legs felt worse than staying. So I stayed. I kept asking myself, in the way that you ask yourself questions you already know the answers to but keep asking anyway because the asking is a form of not deciding, is this worth it? Is Alaska worth it? Is there a version of this life that makes sense? The landscape was extraordinary, genuinely and unfairly beautiful in a way that could make you forget for whole stretches of time that you were also cold and lonely and very far from anyone who had known you for more than a year. I had driven the Richardson Highway twice in the fall, before the snow locked everything down, and the way the Alaska Range sits in the distance on a clear day, enormous and indifferent and white, had done something to me that I didn't have vocabulary for. Made me feel irrelevant in a way that was, strangely, a relief. Like the mountains had looked at my problems and couldn't even be bothered to be unimpressed. But February in interior Alaska is a different proposition entirely. February is when the cold stops being a fact of life and becomes a presence. A weight. You can feel it through every wall of every building, a constant pressure, a reminder that the structures humans build are thin and temporary and that the cold existed long before us and is waiting patiently. The wildlife disappears. The moose, which had been an almost daily sighting in the fall, enormous and prehistoric and absurd, standing in parking lots and medians with the calm authority of something that evolved before convenience, were somewhere in the boreal forest now, conserving heat, letting their metabolism idle. The ravens stayed. Ravens always stay. They hop around parking lots and dumpsters in Fairbanks in February with a specific grim energy that feels less like survival and more like spite. I had driven to Delta Junction for work. A client had physical servers at a small logistics company there, one of those operations that exists in the specific economic niche that Alaska creates, moving supplies along the Richardson Highway to communities that have no other reliable supply chain, and they'd had a rate failure that I needed to address in person. Delta Junction is about 100 miles southeast of Fairbanks, which in normal circumstances is a 90-minute drive. In February, on the Richardson, at night, it takes longer and it costs more, psychologically, than the mileage suggests. I finished at the client's site around 11:30 p.m. Later than I'd intended. The work had been more involved than the initial diagnosis suggested, it always is, and by the time I was loading my tools back into the Ram's cab, the temperature outside was 8 below and still dropping, the kind of cold that seizes the inside of your nose on the first breath and makes your eyes water in a way that freezes on your lashes before it can fall. The Richardson Highway stretched back toward Fairbanks through darkness so complete that the stars were outrageous with it, more stars than sky, the Milky Way not a suggestion but a brute fact overhead, and I remember standing by my truck for 30 seconds just looking up and feeling that specific, uncomfortable Alaskan feeling of being very small in a very large place that has never needed you. I called Diane before I left. I don't know why. Old reflex, I told myself, she was the person I called when I was somewhere late and tired and heading home. She didn't answer. Of course she didn't answer. I sat in the parking lot with the engine running for 5 minutes waiting for the cab to heat up enough that my fingers could work the GPS properly, and I thought about Nevada, about the aggressive mediocrity of being warm and surrounded by chain restaurants and people who thought Alaska was a personality, and I decided, not for the first time, but maybe with slightly less conviction than usual, that I was staying. I was staying because leaving felt like conceding something fundamental about who I was, and I wasn't ready to do that. And also because the Richardson Highway was actually quite beautiful in my headlights, even in February, even alone, even at midnight. That assessment lasted about 45 minutes. The lights came on behind me at 2:07 a.m. according to my dashboard clock. Red and blue, the specific visual cadence of law enforcement that triggers something older than thought, not fear exactly, not at first, but a full-body alertness, a sudden and involuntary inventory of everything you've done in the last 24 hours. My speed. My registration. My insurance card in the glove box. I was on a flat, straight stretch of the Richardson about 15 miles north of Delta Junction, and there was nothing on either side of the road but black spruce and darkness, and I slowed and pulled onto the gravel shoulder with the careful, exaggerated compliance of someone who wants to telegraph harmlessness as loudly as possible. I put it in park. I turned on my interior light, something I've read you should do during traffic stops, make the officer comfortable, give them full visibility, and I sat with my hands on the steering wheel and waited. The trooper took a while to get out of the cruiser. I could see it in my mirrors, white, the Alaska State Trooper's distinctive wide-angle patrol vehicle, parked at the standard diagonal behind me, lights still rolling. A solid minute passed with no one getting out. 2 minutes. I told myself he was running my plates. Standard procedure. I focused on keeping my hands visible and my breathing slow, and I watched the mirror. When he finally got out, he moved correctly. He moved the way you expect a trained law enforcement officer to move on a nighttime traffic stop, purposeful, controlled, staying to the left of my vehicle, keeping himself out of the line of any potential traffic from behind. Uniform correct, the AST blue, the shoulder patches, the hat with the fur lining that you wear in February because the alternative is frostbite on the tips of your ears. He had a flashlight but wasn't shining it into my cab aggressively, another detail that read as professional. I rolled down my window. The cold came in like a solid thing. License, registration, and proof of insurance, he said. His voice was flat. Not rude, not warm. Functional. I handed over my Nevada license, still hadn't updated it to Alaska, which I was aware was technically overdue, and the registration and insurance printout from the glove box. He took them. He looked at them. And then he stood there, just outside my window, and he looked at me. Not at the documents. At me. I said, "Is there something wrong?" I don't think I was speeding. He didn't answer. He turned the flashlight on, not into my face but toward the documents, and he examined them with a thoroughness that exceeded what the moment required. Then he looked at me again. Just looked. His face was in shadow from the angle of the hat brim and the way the flashlight was positioned, and I couldn't read his expression with any confidence, but something about the quality of his attention, the absolute stillness of his body, the unhurried nature of it, the sense that he was not reviewing information but accumulating it, sent the first real tendril of rawness up the back of my neck. I told myself I was tired. 8 below outside and midnight and alone on a highway, and I'd been working since 8 in the morning. The brain distorts when it's pushed past comfortable limits. I knew this. I had read enough about sleep deprivation and decision fatigue to understand that your threat assessment systems become unreliable after a certain point, that the same neural machinery that once kept our ancestors alive in genuinely dangerous environments starts firing at things that don't warrant it. Pattern recognition gone anxious and wild. But he just kept standing there. 5 minutes. By my dashboard clock. 5 full minutes of standing beside my window in 8 below darkness on a highway with no other traffic in either direction, holding my documents, not speaking, not radioing in, just present. In the way that things are present when they intend to remain. "Officer," I said, keeping my voice level, "can you tell me what this stop is about?" He moved his flashlight beam to my face then, just briefly, just long enough for it to register as something other than accidental, and then he moved it away. He handed my documents back through the window. "You can go," he said. This time. Those 3 words. This time. I've turned them over so many times in the month since that they've worn smooth from handling, and I still cannot find an interpretation that doesn't horrify me. This time implies previous times. This time implies a future time when the answer might be different. This time is not a thing that law enforcement says during a routine traffic stop unless something is wrong with either the officer or the entire situation. I drove away. I want to be honest about how I drove away, not calmly, not with composure. I drove away the way you drive when you have just been told a sentence that your body understood before your brain caught up. I drove at exactly the speed limit and I watched my mirrors for the entire 15 miles to where the Richardson meets the outskirts of North Pole, the small town south of Fairbanks, named with a cheerfulness that felt, in that moment, obscene, and the trooper's lights went off behind me almost immediately after I pulled away. I couldn't see if he followed. The road behind me was dark and I was alone on it. I got home to Fairbanks at 3:15. I sat in the parking lot of my apartment building for 6 minutes without getting out. The temperature was 11 below. Above me, the northern lights were doing something beautiful and grotesque at the same time, green and violet, folding and unfolding across the sky like something alive and very large rearranging itself, which is another thing about Alaska that I could never fully decide was magnificent or frightening. Maybe both. Maybe that's the same thing. I went inside. I didn't sleep. I drank most of a pot of coffee and I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and I searched the Alaska State Troopers dispatch records, which are publicly available in summary form on the AST website, for any patrol activity logged on the Richardson Highway between Delta Junction and Fairbanks during the previous night. Nothing. No stops. No activity. The nearest logged patrol had been on the Parks Highway near Nenana, which is in the opposite direction entirely. I told myself this proved nothing. Dispatch logs aren't always complete, aren't always updated in real time. I told myself there were explanations. I almost convinced myself. Then I called the AST Delta Junction post in the morning when they opened. I spoke to a civilian dispatcher who was politely and professionally unhelpful in that specific government way, and then I asked to speak to whoever handled the Richardson corridor the previous night, and after a long hold I was connected to a Sergeant Halvorson who had a careful voice that told me he was choosing his words before using them. I told him about the stop. The time, the location, the vehicle, the uniform. The 5 minutes of silence. This time. There was a pause on his end that lasted long enough that I checked my phone screen to see if the call had dropped. "Sir," he said, "can you describe the patrol vehicle?" I described it. White, standard AST configuration, gold trim, light bar on the roof, antennae on the trunk. Another pause. And the officer's uniform. I described it. Correctly, I was certain. I had looked at it carefully because looking carefully at things is a reflex I have, and because something in me had already known, in some inarticulate preverbal way, that I might need to remember. Halvorson asked me to hold. I held for 4 minutes. When he came back, his voice had changed in a way I couldn't fully categorize, lower, more deliberate, the specific register of a professional who has received information they were hoping not to receive. He told me that no AST units had been dispatched to the Richardson between Delta Junction and Fairbanks at any point during the night in question. He told me that the stretch of highway I described was outside the regular patrol rotation in winter, that resources were concentrated in higher traffic corridors during February. He told me that if I had been stopped by someone on that road at that time, he could not account for who it was or what agency they represented. Then he asked me something that made the coffee in my stomach go cold. "Did he touch your vehicle at any point?" he said. "Door handle, bumper, anything?" "Not that I saw," I said. "Did he ask you to get out of the vehicle?" "No." "Did he ask for anything other than the standard documents?" I thought about it. Really thought. The documents. The 5 minutes of standing. The flashlight to my face. This time. No, I said. He took my contact information. He told me that someone would follow up. He said it with the delivery of a person who has said something because the procedure requires it and not because they believe it. No one followed up. It has been 4 months. I looked up after that call because the mind goes to terrible places when it is given enough ambiguity and enough time. I looked up unsolved cases on the Richardson and the Parks and the Dalton highways over the previous 5 years. There is a website maintained by a woman in Anchorage whose brother disappeared on the Dalton in 2019 that aggregates these cases. Missing persons. Abandoned vehicles found on highway shoulders, engines still warm, belongings still inside, no sign of the driver. There are more of these than you would think. More than you would want to think. Alaska is the kind of place where the infrastructure of disappearance is already in place. The wilderness is absolute, the winters are brutal, the distances between populated areas are vast in a way that the lower 48 genuinely cannot map onto. A person can disappear on the Richardson Highway in February and the cold alone will do the work of concealment before anyone thinks to look. On that website I found a photograph. Submitted by a trucker who had been stopped on the Parks Highway near Nenana 2 winters ago. A photograph taken through a driver's side window, blurry with the shakiness of someone who took it quickly and carefully, of a man in an AST uniform standing beside his cab. The face was not clear. The face was never going to be clear, because the photograph was taken at 2 in the morning with a phone camera through glass that had ice crystals in the lower corners. But the build was right. The hat was right. The absolute stillness of the posture, the unhurried, patient, complete stillness, was right. The trucker who submitted the photograph had written a short description beneath it. He described a stop. 20 minutes of silence. Documents examined and returned. The same words at the end, the exact same 3 words, delivered in a flat voice with no elaboration. You can go. This time. I am writing this from my apartment on Cushman Street in Fairbanks. It is June now, which means the daylight is obscene in the opposite direction, 21 hours of sun, the kind that makes your body forget its edges, that makes time feel like a medium you're suspended in rather than something passing. The tourists are here. The Richardson Highway is full of RVs with bumper stickers from Florida and Texas whose drivers have no idea what the road is in February, what the silence is, what it costs. I still ask myself if Alaska is worth it. I ask myself less often now, which I've decided to interpret as adaptation rather than resignation. I have learned, in 4 months, to check my rearview mirror more than I used to. I have learned to notice when a car behind me matches my speed for longer than coincidence explains. I have learned what the absence of other vehicles on a dark highway actually means, which is that if something happens to you out there, the cold will know about it long before anyone else does. I haven't called Diane. I think about calling her sometimes, not to get back together but just to hear a voice that knows my name without having looked it up, that knows something about who I was before Alaska made me different. But I don't call. She's building her life and I'm building mine, whatever that means now. I renew my lease. Another 12 months. When people ask me why I stay, I tell them about the mountains, about the light in October, about the ravens in February that hop around parking lots like they're daring the cold to try something. All of which is true. What I don't tell them is the other reason. The reason I stay is because somewhere on the Richardson Highway between Delta Junction and Fairbanks, in the dark and the cold and the absolute wilderness, something looked at me and decided not to. And I need to understand that before I leave. I need to know I was looked at by, and why the math worked out in my favor that night, and whether the math has changed. Because this time is a promise. It is also a threat. And I have not yet decided which one to be more afraid of. habit that my ex-wife used to call compulsive and my therapist used to call a coping mechanism with organizational benefits, which is the kind of sentence that costs $240 an hour to hear and means absolutely nothing. The habit is this: I document everything. Receipts, mileage, timestamps, voice memos, screenshots. Not because I'm paranoid, I wasn't, not then, but because I grew up poor in a way that made me pathologically afraid of disputes I couldn't prove. When you grow up without money, you learn that the truth is only as valuable as your ability to demonstrate it, and so I demonstrate everything, always, with the reflexive thoroughness of someone who once lost a security deposit they couldn't afford to lose because they had no photographs of the apartment's condition on move-in day. This habit saved my life. I think. I'm still not entirely certain what it saved me from, which is part of why I'm still awake at 3 in the morning 6 weeks later, sitting in the kitchen of my apartment in Anchorage with all the lights on, writing this on a laptop whose screen is the brightest thing in a building full of sleeping people who do not know what I know. I moved to Juneau 14 months ago for a position with the state's Department of Fish and Game. Wildlife Data Analyst. I process population telemetry, migration patterns, GPS collar data from tagged animals, wolves, caribou, Dall sheep, brown bear. I sit in a government building and I look at the movement of wild things across the Alaskan landscape and I translate that movement into numbers, into reports, into the kind of dry bureaucratic language that allows humans to make decisions about ecosystems they will never personally stand inside. It's good work. I believe in it. But Juneau itself, Juneau is a particular kind of difficult, and I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else. Juneau is the only state capital in the United States that cannot be reached by road. You fly in or you take a ferry, and when you are there you are, in a very real geographic sense, surrounded by the Inside Passage on one side, by the Coast Mountains on the other, by the Tongass National Forest pressing in from every direction with the specific, indifferent enormity of old-growth temperate rainforest that has existed for longer than the concept of a city. It rains there approximately 230 days per year. Not dramatic rain, not thunderstorm rain, but the constant, gray, low-ceiling mist rain of a place that the atmosphere has decided to perpetually marinate. I had been told, before I moved, that people either fall in love with Juneau's isolation or they break against it, and that there is no middle category. I was breaking. Slowly, quietly, in the way that things break when the stress is distributed evenly over a long period of time rather than concentrated in a single catastrophic event. I miss driving. I miss the psychological freedom of knowing that if things became intolerable I could get in a car and go somewhere, could choose a direction and commit to it and watch the landscape change around me as proof that I was a person in motion rather than a person trapped. In Juneau that option doesn't exist, and its absence had settled into me like a low-grade fever that I'd stopped noticing was abnormal. So when I learned that the department needed someone to drive a data collection vehicle from Juneau, by ferry to Haines, then overland, down through the Yukon and back into Alaska through Talk, along the Glen Highway to Anchorage, I volunteered before the email was fully loaded on my screen. The drive was approximately 850 miles, most of it through terrain that most Americans will never see and could not fully conceptualize from the safety of their regular lives. It would take 2 days minimum. I would be transporting 3 laptops of field data and a Pelican case of tracking equipment, and I would have a government vehicle, a 2021 Toyota Tundra, and I would be entirely alone for the majority of it. Everyone at the office thought I was strange for being excited. I thought they were strange for not understanding. I left Juneau by ferry to Haines on a Tuesday in late September. The crossing through the Lynn Canal takes about 4 hours, and the water was doing something extraordinary and disturbing at the same time, flat and pewter gray with the mountains rising on both sides so steeply that the sky was a narrow band overhead, and the whole scene had the quality of traveling through something that had been deliberately designed to make you feel enclosed. Eagles sat on the spruce branches along the shoreline in numbers that should have been magnificent and were instead, in the gray light, somehow ominous. 17 of them in a single tree. I counted. Eagles are scavengers as much as hunters, and 17 of them in one tree means something nearby is dead or dying, and I didn't want to think too carefully about what, so I went inside the ferry and got a cup of terrible coffee from the cafeteria and sat with my phone and checked my email and felt, for the first time in months, that I was pointed in a direction. The drive through the Yukon was everything I had needed it to be. The Alaska Highway through the Canadian interior is one of those roads that reorganizes your sense of scale. You drive for an hour and the mountains visible ahead are the same mountains, and you understand in your body, not just your mind, that distance up here is a different unit of measurement than distance anywhere you have previously lived. I stopped in Destruction Bay for gas, which is a settlement so small that it barely qualifies as a community and whose name I've never been able to hear without a small involuntary tightening in the chest. I stopped again in Beaver Creek at the last Canadian services before the border. I crossed back into Alaska at the Port Elkin crossing without incident. I was using a navigation app called Route Tracker Pro, a government-issued application that the department used for all field vehicle movement, which logged GPS position continuously, took automatic location photos at irregular intervals using the vehicle's dash cam, and uploaded everything to a department server in real time with a local backup stored on my phone. I want to be precise about this because the precision matters. I did not set up this logging. It was factory-enabled in the department vehicle. I did not think about it at all during the drive. I had forgotten, in the way that you forget about the automatic functions of systems you did not personally configure, that it existed. I arrived in Tok in the early afternoon of the second day. Tok is a small community at the junction of the Alaska Highway and the Glen Highway, the kind of crossroads town that exists specifically because of its crossroads nature, with a gas station and a few motels and a diner that served me the best bowl of chili I have eaten in my adult life, without exaggeration, the kind of chili that tastes like someone put weather into a bowl. I asked the woman who brought it to me how she made it. She said it was her grandmother's recipe and that her grandmother had grown up in Tok and had never left, had lived her entire life within 20 miles of where we were sitting, and had died at 91 without ever feeling the absence of anywhere else. I thought about that for a long time while I ate. I asked myself, sitting at that counter with my chili and my government vehicle in the parking lot and 320 miles of Glen Highway ahead of me, whether Alaska was worth it. Not the assignment, not the drive, Alaska itself. The life I was supposedly building here. I've been asking myself this question with increasing frequency since about month 4 in Juneau, but it had a different quality in Tok than it usually did, a different resonance, as though the question was being asked in a room with better acoustics. The woman's grandmother had lived here her whole life and found it sufficient. But she had also been born here, which means she had never known the alternative, had never had the specific loss of a warmer, more accessible life to mourn. I had known the alternative. The alternative was a 2-bedroom house in Bend, Oregon, and a marriage that had quietly collapsed under the weight of 2 people who had stopped being able to see each other's reasons for anything. I had come to Alaska because the alternative had stopped working, not because Alaska had called to me. There's a difference. I was starting to feel the difference. I left Tok at 2:15 in the afternoon. The Glen Highway heading west toward Anchorage is, for its first 100 miles or so, the kind of road that demands attention without rewarding it, not spectacular, not terrible, just long and straight through boreal forest with the Alaska Range slowly resolving into detail on the horizon ahead. The sun in late September in interior Alaska sits low all day, not the vertical assault of summer but a long, shallow angle that turns everything amber and throws shadows that seem wrong for the time of day, too long for mid-afternoon, filling the spaces between trees with a darkness that looks prematurely nocturnal. I made a voice memo at 4:07 p.m. I do this while driving while I have observations I don't want to lose, field notes, ideas, things I want to remember. This one was about the moose. I had seen 3 in the last 50 miles, all of them behaving in a way that was professionally notable to me, grouped near the road, heads up, not feeding. The posture of prey animals that have detected a predator and are in the assessment phase, not fleeing yet, but oriented, poised. Wolves, almost certainly. The department had collared data on 3 wolf packs in this corridor, and one of them had been showing unusual movement patterns in the September reports I'd processed, expanding its range southeast, possibly responding to caribou migration shifts. I noted this in the memo. I said it was worth a flag to the team. I said it calmly, professionally, into my phone, and then I put the phone in the cup holder and drove. I arrived in Anchorage at 9:43 p.m. Checked into the Marriott on 6th Avenue because the department had a rate there and because I was exhausted in the specific, total way that long solo drives create, not sleepy exactly but hollowed out, the concentration of hours of highway vigilance, leaving a particular kind of vacancy where your personality usually lives. I ate a mediocre room service burger. I called my sister in Portland for 20 minutes and told her the Chilean talk was extraordinary and that the mountains were beautiful and that I was fine, all of which was true. I watched 40 minutes of a documentary about underwater caves on Netflix and fell asleep with the television on and slept without interruption until 6:15 in the morning. My routine when I finish a field drive is to download the route tracker data from the local phone backup, review the GPS log for any anomalies that need to be reported to the fleet management team, mechanical issues, unusual stops, anything that might flag a vehicle for service, and upload the reviewed log to the department server. I did this over coffee in the hotel room, sitting at the small desk by the window with the gray Anchorage morning outside and the sound of the city waking up filtering through the double pane glass. The log covered the full drive from Haines to Anchorage. 847 miles, 21 hours of total recorded movement, including the ferry crossing. The GPS track was a clean line across the map interface. I could follow it like a story. Every gas stop, every diner visit, every moment I had pulled over to stretch or make a call, all of it translated into coordinates and timestamps and the small dot of a vehicle moving through an enormous landscape. There was a stop on the log that I did not remember making. It appeared at 1:47 a.m., approximately 140 miles east of Anchorage, on a small unnamed Forest Service road that branched off the Glen Highway. The log showed the tundra leaving the highway, traveling 0.3 miles on the side road, and stopping. The stop lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Then the vehicle returned to the highway and continued toward Anchorage, arriving at 9:43 p.m. as I had recorded. I stared at this for a long time. Then I did the arithmetic, which did not work. If I had stopped for 4 hours and 11 minutes somewhere in the night, I should have arrived in Anchorage not at 9:43 p.m. but sometime after 2 a.m. The math was irreducible. Either the log was wrong, which was possible, government software fails, GPS has gaps, timestamp synchronization errors occur, or I had lost 4 hours of time in a way I had no memory of whatsoever. I told myself it was a software error. I told myself this with conviction, sitting at a desk at a Marriott in Anchorage in the morning light with coffee and the TV still on in the background, and I believed it well enough to continue with the log review. I noted the anomaly in my fleet report as a possible GPS glitch. I uploaded everything to the server. I went to breakfast. I thought about it over eggs and toast in the hotel restaurant. Ran through the previous day in sequence: talk, the chili, the woman's grandmother, the drive, the moose standing rigid and poised near the road, the voice memo, the amber light. I could account for all of it with the clarity that usually signals genuine memory as opposed to confabulation. I could not account for 1:47 a.m. to 5:58 a.m. on an unnamed road 140 miles east of where I was sitting. Back in the room, I opened Route Tracker again. Not the GPS log this time, the photo log. The automatic photos, taken by the dash cam at irregular intervals. I had never actually looked at these photos during a drive. They existed for fleet management purposes, for insurance purposes, for the specific bureaucratic eventuality of a government vehicle being in an accident and the department needing to demonstrate it had exercised due diligence. I had never thought about them as a record of anything that might be personally relevant. The photos covered the whole drive in the way that flipbook animation covers movement, not continuous, not smooth, but sequential enough to follow. I could see the ferry, the Yukon Highway, the border crossing, Talk, the Glen Highway at dusk, that low amber light turning the road gold. Then night. The dash cam in night mode, which meant lower resolution and a greenish hue that made the road look like footage from a nature documentary about deep-sea environments. The photos at 1:47 a.m. showed the Tundra stopped on the Forest Service Road, exactly where the GPS log placed it. Engine off. I could see this in the photo because the dash cam's orientation caught a sliver of the instrument panel, and the ignition indicator light was dark. I was reclined in the driver's seat. I could see my own shoulder and the side of my head, tilted against the headrest in the attitude of unconscious sleep. The next photo was timestamped 1:52 a.m. 5 minutes later. In it, my posture was unchanged. But outside the driver's side window, the dash cam caught it in the peripheral edge of the frame, where the night mode green faded into the black of the tree line. There was a figure. Standing. Approximately 8 feet from the door, just at the boundary of where the darkness began in earnest, at the edge of whatever the dash cam's light sensitivity could reach. I put my coffee down. The figure was not doing anything. It was simply standing, facing the vehicle. Human-shaped, 2 legs, 2 arms, upright, and wearing something dark. No face visible. The photo resolution and the night mode made fine detail impossible, but the shape was unambiguous, and the proximity, 8 feet from my door, engine off, me unconscious, made something in my autonomic nervous system perform a function that had nothing to do with conscious thought. My hands went cold. The room felt smaller. I moved to the next photo. 1:50 a.m. 6 minutes later. 2 figures. One at the driver's door, one at the passenger door. Same distance, both facing the vehicle. Both still. I sat there and I breathed. I made myself breathe slowly and counted the breaths the way my therapist had taught me to ground myself when anxiety got chemical rather than rational, and I thought, wildlife. Wolves, possibly. The collar data, the moose behavior, the range expansion I had flagged in my voice memo. Wolves are curious. Wolves approach stopped vehicles. The heat signature of an idling or recently stopped vehicle means something to an animal that hunts by metabolic reading. It was wolves. It was large dogs from a homestead. It was a bear. Black bears in September are hyperphagy-driven, desperate and unpredictable, and the garbage-accessible areas near the highway attracted them in patterns I had spent 14 months charting. It was explainable. The figures in the photos were standing with their hands at their sides. Animals don't do that. There were 11 more photos over the next 3 hours and 47 minutes. I looked at all of them. In some the figures were present, in some they were not, or had moved to positions where the dash cam couldn't reach them, behind the vehicle, out of frame. In the photo at 4:33 a.m. there were 4 of them. One at each window. Facing in. Close enough in 2 cases that the dash cam picked up reflections on the glass. The last photo before the vehicle started moving again was at 5:51 a.m. In it, the road ahead was empty. The figures were gone. I was still reclined in the driver's seat, still unconscious, in exactly the posture that had not changed in 4 hours. 11 minutes later, according to the GPS log, the vehicle started moving. Back to the highway. Continuing west toward Anchorage. I do not remember starting the vehicle. I do not remember the drive from whatever mile marker that road was at into Anchorage. I have no memory that begins before the parking garage of the Marriott, walking in from the cold, my bag over my shoulder, thinking about the room service burger. I went to the Anchorage Police Department. I brought my phone, the photos, the GPS log, a printout I made at the hotel business center. I sat across from a detective named Kowalski who had the careful, conserving stillness of someone who has heard a wide variety of things and learned to ration her reactions. She looked at the photos for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at the GPS data. Then she looked at me. She asked me how I felt physically when I woke up in the car. I told her I couldn't remember waking up in the car. She noted this, wrote it down, asked me if I consumed anything unusual that day, food, drink, anything given to me by another person. I thought about the Chilean talk. About the coffee the woman had refilled without being asked. Then I thought about Beaver Creek, the last stop in Canada, where a man I hadn't particularly noticed at the gas station had stood near my vehicle for longer than filling his own tank required, and I had not thought anything of it because it was a small parking lot and sometimes people just stand in parking lots for reasons that have nothing to do with you. I told her about the man at Beaver Creek. She asked me to describe him. I described him. She asked if I could identify him from a photo. I said I thought so. She said she would be in touch with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, for the Beaver Creek jurisdiction. She has been in touch. There is an active investigation. I am not allowed to discuss the specifics, which is a sentence I never imagined saying about anything in my life, because I am a wildlife data analyst who tracks caribou and processes collar data, and my life does not, as a structural matter, contain the active investigation sentence. I am still in Anchorage. I have not gone back to Juneau. I have not decided yet whether that means Juneau specifically is over for me, or whether it means Alaska more broadly, or whether it means something else entirely that I don't have the language for yet. I still ask myself whether Alaska is worth it. I ask it differently now, not as a question about isolation or weather or the particular sadness of being far from the life I used to have, but as a question about what worth it even means when the accounting has shifted so completely that you no longer know what you're measuring. I know this, whatever was on that road at 1:47 a.m. had time. Had patience. Had 4 hours and 11 minutes of standing in the cold at the edge of the Alaska darkness while I was unconscious inside a locked vehicle, and whatever calculation it was running during those 4 hours, it arrived at an answer that left me alive. I don't know if I am grateful for the answer or horrified by the question. I still have Route Tracker Pro on my phone. It's still logging. Even here. Even in the hotel room, even in the restaurant, even walking the 3 blocks to the APD for my 3rd interview last week, the blue dot moving through Anchorage streets, the timestamp updating, the photos clicking at their irregular intervals. I checked this morning. The log shows my apartment building. My truck in the parking lot below, engine off, sitting in the cold. In this morning's first automatic photo, taken at 5:14 a.m. while I was inside sleeping, the parking lot below my window was empty. In the photo taken at 5:31 a.m., there was someone standing beside my truck. Facing the building. Looking up. I have sent this photo to Detective Kowalski. I am waiting for her to call me back. All the lights in my apartment are on. Outside, the first real snow of the season is coming down in the way that Anchorage snow comes down, quiet, total, indifferent, covering everything that was there before with a clean white layer that by morning will look like nothing ever happened at all. The app just took another photo. I can't bring myself to look at it yet. Let me tell you what I know about transmission failures before I tell you anything else, because the mechanical detail matters and because I need you to understand that what happened to me began not with anything supernatural or sinister or outside the boundaries of ordinary American misfortune, but with a 2014 Ford Explorer and a torque converter that had been showing symptoms for 6 weeks that I had chosen, with the specific optimism of someone who cannot afford to deal with a problem right now, to interpret as normal. The shudder at highway speeds. The hesitation between second and third gear that felt, if you were generous, like the transmission thinking before it committed, and if you were honest, like something inside the drivetrain slowly failing to hold itself together. My mechanic in Fairbanks, Terry, a broad, laconic man who had been servicing vehicles in the interior for 22 years and who communicated almost entirely through variations of a single disappointed exhale, had flagged it in August. Had written it on the service ticket in his blocky handwriting, TC shutter, monitor, plan for service. I had looked at the number beside plan for service and had nodded and had driven the Explorer home and had told myself I would deal with it when the contract money cleared, when the project wrapped, when things settled. Things had not settled. They rarely do. And so I was driving south on the Alaska highway in the third week of November with a torque converter that had been monitoring itself all the way to its own conclusion, somewhere in the absolute nowhere between the Alaskan border town of Tok and the Canadian border at Beaver Creek, when the transmission locked. Not gradually. Not with the progressive warning that would have allowed me to limp to a shoulder in an organized manner. It locked the way catastrophic mechanical failures lock, completely, immediately, mid-sentence, the way a conversation ends when someone hangs up. One moment I was traveling at 621 miles an hour through boreal forest in the dark, listening to a podcast about the history of the U.S. Postal Service, and the next moment the drivetrain was rigid and the Explorer was decelerating with a violence that felt personal, like the truck had made a decision about me, and I was fighting the wheel toward the gravel shoulder while the anti-lock brakes did their frantic, computerized best to mediate between my intentions and physics. I came to a stop on the shoulder at 9:47 p.m. I know the time because I looked at the clock on the dashboard with the specific, meaningless precision that people reach for when they have just been frightened and need something concrete to hold. 9:47 p.m. November in interior Alaska. Temperature on the outside gauge, 7 degrees Fahrenheit. The podcast was still playing. Someone was explaining the dead letter office with the cheerful academic enthusiasm of a person who has never been stranded at 9 degrees in the dark on a highway that sees approximately 12 vehicles per hour after nightfall. I turned the podcast off. Here is what I want you to understand about that stretch of highway, because I think people in the lower 48 hear remote Alaskan highway and they assemble an image from things they've seen on television, dramatic mountain panoramas, cinematic isolation, the kind of beautiful desolation that makes good wallpaper. What that stretch of road is, at 9:47 p.m. in November, is something the television version doesn't capture, which is the quality of the darkness and the quality of the silence together. The boreal forest on both sides was not the forest of postcard Alaska, not spruce and mountain grandeur. It was low and dense and claustrophobic, black spruce packed tight as insulation, branches interlocked, the canopy swallowing what little ambient light there was until the world outside my headlights was a single uniform absence. And the silence, when I rolled the window down to listen for traffic, the silence of a place that generates its own. Not peaceful. Occupied. The difference between an empty room and a dark room, which is not the same thing at all. I had cell service. One bar, which in Alaska is the difference between alive and not. I called AAA and sat on hold for 4 minutes and 20 seconds listening to hold music that felt, in context, like a joke, and when I finally reached a dispatcher and described my location, the silence on her end lasted long enough to tell me everything I needed to know about the timeline. The nearest contracted tow was in Tok, approximately 2 hours east. Could be longer given road conditions. Was I in a safe location? Was I visible from the road? I told her I was visible. I turned my hazards on. I told her I would wait. I was asking myself, sitting in the cooling cab with the heater running on battery and the hazards ticking their orange Morse code into the dark, the question I had been asking myself with increasing frequency over the past 8 months. Whether Alaska was worth it. Not the job was fine, a remote infrastructure consulting position that paid well and required nothing of me except competence and a tolerance for video calls at unusual hours, but Alaska itself, the life I was supposedly assembling here. I had moved to Fairbanks from Minneapolis 18 months ago in the way that some people move to foreign countries when their domestic life has reached an impasse, not because the destination is specifically appealing but because the distance itself is the point. Far enough that the wreckage of what you left behind can't follow you on foot. My marriage had ended in March of that previous year. No dramatic fracture, no single catastrophic event, just the slow, grinding depletion of two people who had stopped finding each other interesting, who had mistaken the absence of conflict for the presence of something. Karen had kept the house in Minneapolis. I had kept the Explorer in a storage unit and, eventually, a lease on an apartment on Cushman Street in Fairbanks that smelled faintly of whatever the previous tenant had cooked in large quantities and that had a view of a parking lot that iced over in October and stayed iced until April. Was it worth it? Was the isolation, the darkness, the cold that made your bones feel like they were contracting, the distance from every person who had known you before you decided you needed to be unknown, was any of it worth whatever it was supposed to be in exchange for? I had not answered this question satisfactorily in 18 months. Sitting on a frozen shoulder with a locked transmission and a tow truck 2 hours away, I was not feeling optimistic about answering it tonight. A truck appeared in my rearview mirror 22 minutes after I stopped. Not headlights first, the way oncoming traffic appears. It materialized from behind me, from the direction I had been traveling, a full-size pickup, an older F-250, I thought, domestic, dark-colored, difficult to parse in the limited light, pulling up behind me at a speed that felt considered rather than coincidental. Not a passing vehicle that had noticed my hazards. A vehicle that had stopped for me specifically, which in the abstract is a reassuring thing, and on a dark highway at 10 in the evening in 7-degree November is something else. The man who got out was somewhere in his 60s. I registered this through my side mirror before he reached my window, stocky, deliberate mover, wearing a canvas Carhartt work coat that was dark with age and use, a wool beanie, work gloves. He knocked on my window with one knuckle, the way people knock when they know you can see them, and the knock is courtesy rather than announcement. I rolled it down 2 inches. Cold came in immediately, specific and absolute. "Transmission," he said. Not a question, exactly. More like a confirmation. "Locked up," I said. "I've got tow coming from Talk." He nodded. He had a face that the cold had constructed over decades, not weathered the way skin weathers in warm climates, drying and loosening, but compressed, the lines carved deep, and the complexion a permanent ruddy gray that spoke to a life conducted largely outdoors in temperatures that human beings were not engineered for. His eyes, in the glow of my hazards, were pale. Light blue or light gray, the kind of color that reads differently depending on the light and never reads as warm. 2-hour wait at minimum, he said. "I've got a shop 12 miles back east. Heady Bay. Could have you back on the road tonight." "I've already called the tow," I said. "I know Terry and Talk. Can call him off. Save you the fee." He said Terry's name the way you say the name of someone you've known for a long time, without emphasis, as a piece of information rather than a persuasion tactic. He knew my mechanic's name. Or he knew a Terry and Talk. Terry was not an unusual name. There were certainly multiple Terrys in the Talk to Beaver Creek corridor. I ran this arithmetic quickly and concluded it proved nothing, and simultaneously noted that my nervous system was not operating on proof but on something older and less articulable that was telling me, with the gentle but persistent urgency of a carbon monoxide alarm at low concentration, that something about this man was worth attention. But I was in 7 degrees and my cab was cooling and the tow was 2 hours away and he was offering a heated shop. In Alaska, in November, these facts arrange themselves into a hierarchy that overrides other considerations. The cold is the most persuasive argument any situation can contain. I called AAA back and canceled the tow. I called Terry's shop, no answer, which was not surprising given the hour, but I left a voicemail explaining the situation with the compulsive documenting reflex that I've had since childhood. I texted the shop address the man gave me to my sister in Seattle. She was asleep and wouldn't see it until morning, but it existed in a server somewhere, which felt important in a way I didn't examine too closely. He hooked the Explorer to his truck with a tow chain that had the easy competence of gear used often and maintained well. I rode in my own vehicle, steered while he towed, which is how it's done on roads like this where calling another vehicle would take longer than the tow itself. The 12 miles took about 25 minutes on a road that was fine for the first 8 miles, highway, paved, normal, and then became a gravel access road that I had not noticed on any map I'd looked at, which I attributed to the maps being wrong the way maps in rural Alaska are frequently wrong, updated infrequently if at all. The infrastructure of remote places being considered a low priority by the people who build the databases that the rest of us navigate by. The shop was real. I want to establish this clearly because the temptation in retrospect is to find the eeriness before it was earned, to project the disturbing end backward onto the beginning so that the whole thing reads as inevitably ominous from the first frame. The shop was a real building, a metal pole structure, 2 large bay doors, external floodlights on motion sensors that snapped on when we pulled in, the kind of setup that small operation mechanics in rural Alaska maintain because the alternative is being unable to work for 6 months of the year. Inside, a hydraulic lift, a tool chest the size of a refrigerator, workbench with a pegboard of organized tools, the smell of oil and metal, and the specific olfactory signature of a space that is heated by a propane heater, which is a smell I have always associated with competence in cold climates. Normal. Completely, unremarkably, reassuringly normal. He made coffee on a small drip machine on the workbench while he ran the diagnostic. A single-serve Folgers packet, black, in a ceramic mug that said Alaska, where men are men and moose are nervous, the kind of novelty mug that accumulates in spaces where men work alone for long periods. He handed it to me without asking if I wanted it. I took it because I was cold and because refusing felt rude and because the normalcy of a cup of coffee was something I needed in that moment the way you sometimes need an ordinary object to confirm that ordinary life is still in operation. I drank it while I watched him work. He was good. Efficient, knowledgeable, his hands moving on the transmission components with the economy of someone who has performed the same diagnosis several thousand times and no longer needs to think about the sequence. He talked while he worked, not conversation exactly, more narration. He told me what he was finding. TC solenoid failure, compounded by what looked like a cracked pump gear, which he said was consistent with the shutter pattern I described and which he said he had the parts for, which was the detail that should have registered as slightly improbable and which I did not examine because the coffee was warm and the shop was heated and I was tired. While he worked, I looked around the shop. The workbench. The tool chest. The walls, which had the accumulated visual texture of a space that has been inhabited for a long time, calendars, parts diagrams, faded notices, a few photographs tacked near the bench in the way that photographs end up in workshops, incidentally, as background rather than display. I looked at them the way you look at the walls of a space you're occupying temporarily. A truck on a lift somewhere. A fishing photo, 2 men holding up a king salmon, the scale of it absurd and genuinely Alaskan. A couple of landscapes. And one that I registered, filed, and did not think about again until later. He finished in under 2 hours. The transmission engaged cleanly when he tested it. He charged me cash, $340, which was either a bargain or low enough to be suspicious, and I paid it because he had no card reader and because I had the cash and because at midnight in November on a side road in the Alaska highway corridor you don't negotiate with the person who has just made your car functional again. He poured me a second cup of coffee while I paid. I drank most of it. I drove to talk. I got a room at the Young's Motel at midnight, which is a small, clean, honest establishment that I recommend without reservation to anyone passing through, and I slept for 9 hours and woke up feeling the specific mild fragility that comes after a high-stress day has processed itself out through sleep. I ate breakfast at a diner on the main drag. The woman who brought my eggs had lived and talked for 30 years, she told me, when I mentioned I had car trouble on the highway the previous night. She made the appropriate sympathetic sounds. I told her about the mechanic, about the shop 12 miles west on an access road off the highway. I described the man. She stopped pouring my coffee. Not dramatically. Not the horror movie full stop. Just a small pause, a half-second interruption in the pour, cup half full, that she completed a moment later and then stood beside my table for a moment with the pot in her hand. 12 miles west, she said. Give or take. An access road, left off the highway heading toward Beaver Creek. She looked at me with an expression I've been trying to categorize ever since. Not skepticism. Not fear. Something between recognition and reluctance, the face of someone who has been told a thing before and has not yet decided how to respond to being told it again. She said she'd be right back. She went to the counter, spoke briefly to another woman, older, possibly the owner, who looked over at me once and then went into the back. When my waitress returned, she had a newspaper. Not today's. Old. She set it on the table next to my eggs and tapped a photograph on the front page without looking at it, the way you touch a thing you don't want to look at directly. It was a photograph of a man. 60s. Stocky. A face that the cold had constructed over decades. The article beside it was dated September 14, 1987. The headline, which I read 3 times to make sure I was reading correctly, Local mechanic missing after shop fire, foul play suspected. The photograph's caption gave his name. The article described a fire of undetermined origin that had destroyed a small vehicle repair operation on an access road approximately 12 miles west of Talk on the Alaska Highway. The mechanic, owner-operator, solo practice, well known in the corridor from Talk to Beaver Creek, had not been seen since the night of the fire. His truck was missing. No body had been recovered. The investigation had concluded, after some months, with no determination of cause and no suspect identified. The missing person file had remained open for 4 years before being administratively closed. I looked at the photograph for a long time. My eggs cooled. The diner made its morning sounds around me, coffee machine, conversation, the bell above the door when someone came in from the cold. The man in the photograph was the man who had fixed my transmission. I know what you're thinking. I thought it too, and I am not a person who thinks these things. I am an infrastructure consultant from Minneapolis who believes in diagnostic data and service invoices and the measurable, empirical resolution of mechanical problems, and I sat in that diner and I applied every rational instrument I had to what I was looking at. Resemblance. Family. A son, a nephew, a relative who had taken over the location, who looked like the man in the photograph because the man in the photograph was his blood. The shop had been rebuilt. The fire had destroyed the original structure and someone had rebuilt it. These things happen. These things are the normal, boring, non-horrifying explanation for a man who looks like a photograph from 1987. I asked the waitress if anyone had rebuilt on that site after the fire. She looked at me with the same expression as before and said, very quietly, that the property had been condemned. That the access road had been closed. There were barriers, she said, county road barriers, that were checked every spring. That as far as she knew, as far as anyone in Talk knew, there had been nothing on that land for 37 years. I drove back out to the highway after breakfast. I drove west, counting miles on my odometer. At 11.8 miles I slowed down and looked for the access road I had turned onto the night before. The road was there. The county barriers were there too, orange and white striped, the kind that fold flat when driven over and are meant to signal closure rather than enforce it, because in Alaska the infrastructure budget does not extend to barriers that can stop a determined vehicle. They were down. Pressed flat into the gravel. Old flat. Not recently flattened. I drove in. At 3/10 of a mile the road ended. Not at a shop. Not at a pole structure with a hydraulic lift and a tool chest and a propane heater. At a concrete foundation, blackened, cracked, overtaken at the edges by 37 years of boreal encroachment, low spruce pressing in, roots lifting the corners, the whole structure in the process of being slowly digested by the landscape. Debris. Charred timber softened by decades of rain and snow into something that looked more geological than architectural. A collapsed chimney. The ghost of a floor plan visible only because concrete is harder to erase than wood. No shop. No floodlights. No lift. On the far edge of the foundation, where the concrete gave way to earth, there was a tire track. Recent. The size of a full-size truck. Coming in from the road I'd just used and stopping at the edge of the slab. And footprints in the light snow that had fallen 2 days ago, boot prints, large, wide set, the stride of a stocky man, circling the slab's perimeter and then stopping at the tire track and not continuing. As though whatever made the prints had gotten back in the truck and left. Or as though they had ended there, at the edge of the blackened concrete, in the same way that everything else on this property had ended. My Explorer's transmission worked perfectly. Still does. I have had Terry look at it twice since November. He cannot find evidence of the repair, not the solenoid replacement, not the pump gear, not the labor. He looked at me the first time with the expression of a man who has learned, in 22 years of working in the Alaska interior, that there are categories of things that happen on the highway that he does not ask follow-up questions about. He told me the transmission was clean. Told me whatever was wrong with it appeared to have resolved itself, which he delivered without apparent irony, in his blocky, flat way, and then he changed my oil and charged me for the oil and I paid and drove home. I am still in Fairbanks. I ask myself less frequently now whether Alaska is worth it, not because the question has been answered but because I've started to understand that the question was always the wrong one. Alaska is not the kind of place that offers itself for evaluation. It does not adjust itself to your cost-benefit analysis or your comfort requirements or your need for the world to behave within the parameters of the explicable. It is a place with its own terms, and the terms include the darkness and the cold and the distances and the things that happen at the boundary between those distances that don't resolve into the categories your mind was built to process. What I am left with, instead of an answer, is a smaller and more specific question. One I turn over every few days, particularly at night, particularly in winter when the dark is complete and the cold is pressing against every wall and the boreal forest outside my apartment window is a black density that contains whatever it contains. The man who fixed my truck, the man who charged me $340 in cash and made me Folgers coffee in a novelty mug and worked on my transmission with the competence of 30 years of doing exactly that, he either was what he appeared to be, in which case there is an explanation I have not found, or he was something else, in which case there is a question I cannot fully form. But here is the thing. Here is the detail I come back to, the one I cannot integrate into either version of events without it disturbing the whole picture. When he handed me the first cup of coffee, I looked at his hands. Mechanic's hands, oil darkened at the knuckles, scarred in the particular way that hands scar when they work with metal, with the engine grain grime that no amount of orange pumice soap fully removes. Real hands. Specific hands. Hands that I shook when I paid him, and the handshake was dry and firm and present. But in the morning, in the diner, when I looked at the photograph from 1987, I saw those hands. In the image he was holding a wrench at his side, the way you hold a tool when someone takes your picture unexpectedly, and the wrench was in his right hand, and the knuckle scar on the index finger was visible. The same scar. 37 years apart. I have no explanation for this. I have tried to build one, the way I build explanations for everything, methodically, with the available materials, checking the structure as I go. I have not been able to make it hold weight. My transmission is fine. The coffee that night was hot. The cash is gone from my wallet, spent by something or someone or some persistence of a man who worked on cars for 30 years and may or may not have stopped when the fire took everything he had built. Outside my window right now, in the parking lot, a raven is sitting on the roof of my Explorer in the cold, doing nothing. Just sitting. Looking at the building with the sideways, ancient, evaluating intelligence of a bird that has been in this landscape longer than any human structure in it. It has been there for 20 minutes. Ravens in Fairbanks in November are a constant presence. They stay when everything sensible leaves. They endure what the winter offers. They are as much a feature of the Alaskan cold as the cold itself. But it's looking at my car. Specifically at my car. And it has not moved, and it is looking at my car, and I have read enough about ravens in my 14 months here to know that they find things. Follow things. Are present, reliably, around things that are no longer alive. I don't know what that means about my car. I don't know what that means about anything. I'm staying inside until it leaves.